On today's Gangster Profile, Prohibition Era Boston, Part 1, King Charles Solomon and Joseph P. Kennedy. Boston isn't the first thing that comes to mind when people think of Prohibition-era gangsters. They usually think of Chicago and Al Capone, or New York and gangsters like Dutch Schultz, but every major city suffered the same negative consequences from this ridiculous law. The 18th Amendment, or the Volstead Act, which was mostly supported by Protestant church folk, the extra conservative and pissed off wives. Can't believe the government really thought this was going to curb the nation's appetite for alcohol. All Prohibition did was make some criminals very rich and powerful. The 20s will always be remembered as a chaotic time when organized crime would root itself in American culture. Prohibition was how the Italian mafia got the seed money to become the power that they were during the 20th century. Their money allowed them to expand their illegal gambling and loan sharking enterprises, as well as capital to bribe countless law enforcement officers and elected officials. The level of corruption that occurred during Prohibition shocked most ordinary citizens. It was the beginning of the public's mistrust in law enforcement and elected officials. The Noble Experiment, as it was dubbed, was a complete failure, and it was repealed a little over a decade after it was turned into law. The only thing it really achieved was the blatant lawlessness in most major cities, and the erosion of American institutions, which continued for decades even after the Volstead Act was repealed. Even though most people's minds don't go right to Boston when they think of Prohibition-era gangsters, it was just as active as any other large U.S. city. With Massachusetts' large coastline full of inlets, bays, and harbors, it was the ideal setting to smuggle in alcohol via the ocean. There was an area 3 miles off the coast called Rum Row. It was located in international waters, so it was patrolled very little. Large ships containing large amounts of alcohol would offload into smaller, faster boats that would make the journey to the coastline. My grandfather said he remembered when he was a little kid, bootleggers would bring alcohol in by boat and land on Front Beach in Rockport, and under the cover of night they would load it into a basement and win one of the houses right on the beach through a secret door. It would be warehoused there until it was shipped to its final destination. I'm sure that in every town and city on the coast had similar operations. These guys were called rum runners or bootleggers. They're the ones that were responsible for the transportation of illegal alcohol. A lot of times they were loosely organized gangs, so they worked for some big gangster, but it wasn't organized crime how we think of it at least. A lot of the booze coming into the country through the sea was legal, alcohol being produced in Europe or Canada. It was being legally made in other countries, and then different criminals would try to smuggle it into America. This was the real high-end stuff. I'm sure there were plenty of moonshiners in Massachusetts. Those are the people that make their own alcohol in homemade stills, usually out in the woods somewhere. Moonshine was more common during Prohibition in Appalachia and more rural areas. There were, of course, plenty of people in Massachusetts cities that were making rock gut bathtub gin. There are countless stories from the Prohibition era of people getting sick from homemade liquor. The city of Boston had a large immigrant and ethnic population in the 1920s. These groups are not in favor of Prohibition. They saw it as an attack on their culture. It was mostly waspy white Protestant Brahmin class of Boston that was in favor of the Volstead Act. The majority Irish, Italian, Eastern European, Jewish, and Greek population in Boston did not support it. Alcohol is a large part of their culture, and almost all their social gatherings involved alcohol. These people didn't appreciate the stuffy Brahmin class dictating to them what was socially acceptable and how to enjoy themselves. A lot of these groups, except minus the Irish, no offense, my nana was 100% Irish, but the rest of these ethnic groups didn't have much of a problem with alcoholism, and it angered them when they were being told that they were now breaking the law by having a couple drinks or a glass of wine with dinner. They were going to find a way around this or just straight up ignore the law. That was pretty obvious from the start. To think that by having a drink you're breaking the law is ridiculous. Same way it was breaking the law 20 years ago to smoke a joint. They've at least come to their senses about marijuana, but it doesn't change the fact that I was arrested every 6 months for it as a teenager. And was treated like a straight criminal for smoking weed. Our government has done the exact same thing with drugs that they did with alcohol during Prohibition. If people in America want to get high, then someone somewhere is going to supply it. By putting a prohibition on drugs, the 60-year so-called war on drugs, all they have accomplished is to build up and fill up a whole shitload of jails and prisons and make drug cartels extremely wealthy and powerful. Did we not, as a country, learn anything from how the Prohibition of alcohol bankrolled the mafia into becoming the national crime syndicate that it became? Now look how powerful these cartels have become since the 1980s. By making drugs completely illegal, we've basically given them a license to print money. In my opinion, until we treat drug addiction as a social and health issue instead of a criminal justice issue, we're never going to see our way out of this drug epidemic as a country. I mean, look at it. 7 years later, it's worse than ever. One such man that profited tremendously from Prohibition was none other than Joseph P. Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy family dynasty. Joseph's son John Fitzgerald Kennedy would go on to become the first Irish Catholic president of the United States. This was a huge deal and was the pinnacle of being Irish American, especially in Boston, well, maybe second to only when The Departed came out. Joseph raised his and his family's station to unimaginable heights, and he did it with the proceeds of illegally bootlegging alcohol. Joseph Kennedy apparently owned a fleet of speedboats that made the run back and forth to Rum Row. Joseph Kennedy was connected to some of the top mobsters of the day, like New York super bootlegger Big Bill Dwyer and his partner, notorious Hell's Kitchen Irish gangster Oni the Killer Madden. It is alleged that he tapped his vast underworld connections decades later to help his son win the incredibly close 1960s presidential election against Richard Nixon. It was speculated that JFK won by a narrow margin when thousands of dead people voted in Chicago and other mob-controlled cities. This is the most likely conspiracy theory while JFK was assassinated. As soon as he was elected, he named his brother Robert as Attorney General, and he made it his only purpose on earth to go after the Mafia. He did it in a very public and disrespectful way. Of course, the Mafia felt completely disrespected and double-crossed. The Mafia was extremely angry, and unfortunately, it looks like JFK lost his life because of it. Joseph Kennedy was just as much a criminal as any other bootlegger or gangster during Prohibition. The only difference was that Joseph did not use the proceeds to further his criminal enterprises. He put the money into legitimate businesses and real estate. He was focused on becoming an elitist. He made sure all his children went to Ivy League schools and got into politics. He was dynasty building. He amassed an incredible fortune of generational wealth and made the Kennedy name will always be synonymous with American royalty. But it's important to remember that it was built on a foundation of illegal proceeds from bootlegging. Joseph put himself and generation after generation of Kennedys in a position to succeed by participating in an illegal international alcohol distribution network. A lot of people agree the deaths of his two sons maybe have karma for Papa Joe's bad deeds. Boston is an overwhelmingly Irish city, and the famous North End and East Boston have been an Italian stronghold since the turn of the 20th century. But not so oftenly talked about was Boston's large Eastern European Jewish population. Like all other immigrant groups, the Jewish immigrants first stopped at the North End. They quickly moved to the historic West End before moving into Roxbury and Mattapan. That's until the 1950s. By the 1960s, those neighborhoods had mostly become black, and the Jewish residents moved to Brookline, Newton, and other suburbs. Now, Boston didn't have as many notorious Jewish prohibitionary gangsters like New York City. The Lower East Side of Manhattan and across the bridge in Brooklyn produced some of the most feared Jewish gangsters of all time, like Meyer Lansky, Lepke Bullcoulter, and Bugsy Siegel. They also had the infamous hitman squad, Murder Inc. Boston did have King Charles Solomon, though. The Boston Jewish Godfather was a rum runner, an original narcotics trafficker, a nightclub owner, and a reputed pimp, but there was never any factual evidence of that last one that I could find. His operations were so elaborate that he was dubbed by a federal agent as the Capone of the East. A bit sketchy about the early life of King Solomon. He was born in 1884 in Russia to Jewish parents Joseph and Sarah Bloom. After immigrating to America, he either grew up in a West End tenement or in the North Shore city of Salem, Mass. It was said that Solomon owned the biggest fleet of speedboats called rum runners in the city of Boston and had connections up and down the East Coast. He amassed a gigantic fortune during Prohibition. He owned a rum distillery in Central America and produced and transported all himself. He controlled radio stations on Long Island in New York that would radio his boats through the narrow straits and warn them of danger ahead. Solomon hobnobbed with celebrities and was said to keep the company of beautiful women and vaudeville starlets of the day. He was a dashing figure, always dressed impeccably, and he was remembered as being polite and classy. Solomon owned the Coconut Grove Club in Boston, which was a very popular nightclub. He was there most nights socializing and making a considerable amount of legit income. He was also one of the very first narcotics traffickers in the city of Boston. He had connections to New York's Arnold the Brain Rothstein, who famously fixed the 1919 World Series. They were some of the first people in the underworld to see the value of narcotics. They were dealing a lot in raw opium and morphine. They were just starting to really get into synthesizing heroin at this point. It was in the early stages and it was kind of a niche market still. The only time King Solomon ever went to prison was for a narcotics case. He was the biggest bootlegger in the city of Boston, but he never got locked up for it. That shows how aggressively they were prosecuting it. While in trial for narcotics, he perjured himself and was sentenced to 5 years, but after I'm sure greasing the right palms, he only did 13 months. A reporter asked him when he got out of prison, "Solomon, you're so rich, why don't you retire?" He said, "Don't be silly, I love the nightlife too much." Now, on the night of January 24th, 1933, King Solomon was under federal indictment and was probably going back to prison. He closed up the Coconut Grove for the night, and with a few of his employees, he took a car service to the Hoppin' Cotton Club on Tremont Street in Boston's South End. They were partying hard around 3:30 a.m. when Solomon got up to use the bathroom. Now, whether or not he noticed the table near him full of Irish and one Greek hoods sipping their drinks and watching him, 3 men followed Solomon to the bathroom. From outside, you could hear a struggle. "You dirty double-crossing rats! You got my bankroll! What else do you want?" Another voice said, "You had this coming a long time," and then gunshots. The men fled, then Solomon came out stumbling and bleeding from his abdomen. "Those dirty double-crossing rats, they got me!" before he collapsed on the floor. He was rushed to Boston City Hospital. Before he went unconscious, he refused to talk to a detective. He died shortly after. His funeral was a huge ordeal with thousands of people watching the procession. The Boston Globe wrote, "Bullets sang the requiem of King Charles Solomon yesterday and wiped forever the smile from his face that thousands knew." Hundreds of mourners followed the casket to his burial site at the Hand-in-Hand Jewish Cemetery in Roxbury. 3,000 people attended the wake at his Brookline house, which the Boston Globe described the attendees as the following: cops, reporters, photographers, lawyers, small fry racketeers, and little Caesars of the gangland who kept their right hands in their pockets and answered all questions with the word "scram." The newspaper really wrote that. Now, in my next video about the Prohibition era, I'll discuss the South Boston Irish Gusting Gang and their political connections, as well as the birth of the Italian Mafia in Boston. If you like this video, hit that old like button, leave a comment, make a request, subscribe if you haven't already, and we cruise right past that 500 subscriber mark. I'm very grateful for all you girls and guys, mostly guys. Keep tuning in, and remember, most of all, to have a great day and take great care of yourself.